A mother walks down her own basement stairs in the middle of the night, expecting nothing more than a mess to clean up or a forgotten load of laundry. Instead, she finds a black bucket sitting near the bottom of the steps, and when she looks inside, her entire world collapses in a single second. What she discovered that night in Green Bay, Wisconsin, would go on to become one of the most disturbing homicide cases the state has ever prosecuted. And the woman responsible wasn't some stranger who'd slipped into the house unnoticed. She was someone the victim's own family had known for years, someone who'd sat at their kitchen table, someone who'd known their son since high school. This is the story of Taylor Schabusiness, a woman with a documented, disturbing fascination with Wisconsin's most infamous serial killer, and how that fascination collided with addiction, mental illness, and a night of violence that ended in dismemberment. Long before any of this happened, before the headlines and the courtroom outbursts and the years of appeals, she was just a kid. Her name was Taylor Denise Coronado, born in Chicago in November of 1997, and by most accounts her early childhood looked unremarkable. Her family eventually relocated to Wisconsin while she was still in elementary school, and for a while life carried on the way it does for most kids. School in the morning, home in the evening, nothing that stood out. Then, when she was 11 years old, the floor dropped out from under her. Her mother Marla died after a long illness, and for a child that age, losing a parent isn't just grief, it's the collapse of the one thing that was supposed to be permanent. According to her father, that loss changed something fundamental in her. By the time she reached her senior year of high school, she was getting into physical fights with classmates, and one of those fights got her expelled. Her family made the decision to send her to live with relatives in Texas so she could finish her diploma somewhere else, away from whatever was pulling her off course back home. She did graduate, but the stability didn't last, and she eventually made her way back to Wisconsin, back to the place where her life would take the turn that ultimately ended in tragedy. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because the man who raised her carries his own complicated history. Her father, Arturo, later testified in court on her behalf, describing himself as someone who loved his daughter and would do anything to help her. But by the time he gave that testimony, he was doing it from behind bars himself, shackled and dressed in an inmate jumpsuit, serving a lengthy sentence on an unrelated charge involving a child. It's a detail that adds an unsettling layer to an already unsettling family history. A reminder that the environment someone grows up in doesn't excuse what they do later in life, but it can shape the road that leads them there. Once she was back in Wisconsin, she reconnected with a man named Warren. According to family members, Warren introduced her to far harder substances than anything she'd used before: heroin, methamphetamine, and her drug use escalated quickly after that. Somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, the two of them fell for each other anyway, and they got married on Valentine's Day in 2020. Not long after the wedding, the couple made the unusual decision to legally change their last name, a decision reportedly made during a stretch of heavy drug use, and the name they chose would later be splashed across news headlines across the entire country. Behind the scenes, though, her mental health was already unraveling fast. Police records show an arrest in 2020 stemming from an altercation with law enforcement, during which she reportedly told responding officers she'd just used drugs and showed them fresh track marks on her arm. Witnesses said she'd been trying to walk into oncoming traffic, and officers had to physically restrain her. It got serious enough that her father made the difficult call to bring her to a psychiatric facility, terrified she might hurt herself if he didn't. He later testified about that moment, saying he feared for her safety and that the two of them had agreed together that she needed help, even though the facility ultimately released her not long after. By 2021, she had survived a suicide attempt and been diagnosed with both post-traumatic stress disorder and bipolar disorder. That same year, she gave birth to a child with Warren, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Warren was cycling in and out of custody, first for a parole violation and later on federal drug charges, and Taylor herself was in no position to raise a baby alone while her own life was falling apart around her. The child ended up moving to Texas to live with relatives, the same family members who had taken Taylor in years earlier during her senior year of high school. Taylor stayed behind in Wisconsin, still legally married to a man who was mostly behind bars, and with him gone, she reconnected with an old friend from her school days, a 24-year-old named Shad. Those who knew him described him as gentle, easygoing, someone without a mean bone in his body. But like Taylor, Shad struggled with his own addiction, and the relationship between the two of them wasn't built on romance so much as shared drug use. It was a connection built on getting high together, and that connection would ultimately cost him his life. His mother later described him as mild-mannered growing up, someone who was happy and easy to be around, the kind of kid who never gave his family serious trouble even as addiction crept into his adult life. He was 24 years old, still living at home with his mother and her boyfriend, still trying to find his footing, and by every account, nobody in his life saw this coming. Nobody could have. It helps to understand the timeline a little more closely, because the hours leading up to Shad's death read almost like an ordinary night out for two people caught in the grip of addiction. Around 9:30 in the evening on February 21st, 2022, Taylor picked Shad up from his mother's home, and the two of them met up with another friend at a nearby apartment to smoke marijuana together. Nothing that stood out as unusual for either of them. From there, they made their way back to Shad's mother's house, and because she and her boyfriend were away for the night, the two of them had the place to themselves. They headed down to the basement, a space that would soon become a crime scene unlike anything local investigators had ever processed. According to later testimony, the two of them used methamphetamine and injected a sedating prescription medication before becoming intimate, engaging in a type of sexual activity that involved intentionally restricting oxygen for arousal, something Taylor would later admit they'd done together before. But this time, according to her own later statements, she didn't stop when she should have. Something shifted from a dangerous but consensual act into something fatal, and by the time Shad's mother returned home the next day and went downstairs to check on her son, he was already gone. What she found in that basement would haunt her for the rest of her life. The 911 call that followed is difficult to even describe. A family member who'd gone down to check on the commotion struggled to get the words out, describing something in a bucket that he couldn't fully process, saying he wasn't sure what he was even looking at. When Shad's mother eventually got on the phone herself, she said it as plainly and as horrifically as it could be said, that she believed she had found her son's head. Green Bay police arrived to a scene that officers would later describe as unlike anything they had worked before in their careers. They documented human remains scattered through the basement, an amount of evidence so severe that responding units immediately radioed for backup and began treating the entire home as an active crime scene. Officials would later confirm what the family had already feared in the worst way possible. The remains belonged to Shad, and whoever had done this had gone to horrifying lengths, not just to kill him, but to take his body apart afterward. Detectives didn't have to look far for a suspect. Shad's mother knew exactly who her son had been with that night. A woman from his past that he'd known since high school, someone the family had only ever known by her married name. Investigators traced her to her last known address, and it didn't take long before they noticed something that stopped them cold. What looked like a trail of blood leading toward her apartment door. When officers eventually took her into custody, several of them later described her demeanor as strangely calm, almost detached, for someone who had just been arrested in connection with something this brutal. That eerie calm would not last long once she was sitting inside an interrogation room. What came out during questioning shocked even seasoned detectives who had seen plenty over the course of their careers. Taylor admitted to being with Shad that night, describing a sexual encounter involving choking that spiraled far past anything either of them had intended. According to her own account, given in a strangely flat, matter-of-fact tone, she didn't stop even as it became clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She never called for help. No ambulance. No frantic 911 call from her end. Just silence. And then, by her own admission, she began cutting up his body afterward. She led detectives to a van parked outside her apartment, where more remains were recovered, and she described in unsettling and fragmented detail disposing of certain body parts while keeping others closer to her. At one point during questioning, she offered a chilling explanation for her own behavior, describing an almost poetic and deeply disturbing justification, framing her attachment to the people she loved as something that consumed and ultimately destroyed whatever she got close to. Throughout the interrogation, she repeatedly pointed to a days-long methamphetamine binge as the reason behind her actions, insisting she'd barely slept and had been using heavily in the lead-up to that night. But investigators weren't fully satisfied that drug use alone could explain the level of precision, planning, and follow-through involved in everything that happened after Shad died. A search of Taylor's vehicle turned up even more remains hidden inside a household storage container tucked among ordinary laundry. Back at the house where the killing occurred, investigators recovered multiple knives, additional body parts sealed inside plastic shopping bags, and internal organs stored separately inside a plastic storage tote. The sheer scale of what had been done to Shad's body went far beyond the act of killing itself, and it became clear almost immediately that this case was going to involve some of the most graphic forensic testimony a Wisconsin courtroom had heard in years. When the medical examiner eventually took the stand, he described the official cause of death as strangulation, and he was unambiguous in explaining that the dismemberment had happened afterward, likely over the course of several hours, based on the complete absence of active bleeding in those wounds. The body had been decapitated, the torso had been separated, and internal organs had been removed one at a time in what he described as a lengthy and deliberate process. He also confirmed that the body had been castrated. In his professional opinion, delivered calmly and clinically to a visibly stunned courtroom, it was one of the most extensive instances of post-mortem mutilation he had ever personally documented in his career. Here's where the story takes an even darker turn, one that would end up shaping the entire public narrative around this case. When investigators pulled Taylor's phone records, they found more than 24 searches related to Jeffrey Dahmer, Wisconsin's most infamous serial killer, conducted in the days leading directly up to Shad's death. Some of those searches referenced Dahmer by name directly. Others referenced anatomical terms and definitions related to human remains. One particular entry in her search history showed that she had taken a selfie with an image of Dahmer displayed on her phone screen, smiling as though the two of them were posing together just days before the murder took place. Prosecutors argued in court that this pattern wasn't some strange coincidence, that it painted a picture of someone who might have been fixated on extreme violence well before that February night ever happened. To many people following the case as it unfolded in the news, that detail alone was almost as disturbing as the crime itself, because it suggested premeditation layered underneath what the defense would later try to frame as a drug-fueled, uncontrollable breakdown. By the time her trial finally opened in July of 2023, the courtroom had already been primed for just how graphic this case was going to get. Prosecutors laid out their timeline methodically, walking jurors through the discovery, the interrogation footage, and the mountain of forensic evidence piece by piece, while Taylor's defense team leaned hard into one central argument, that the burden of proof rested entirely with the state, and that a guilty verdict required proving every single element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury heard testimony from the responding officers who first walked into that basement, from the medical examiner who performed the autopsy, and, most gut-wrenching of all, from Shad's own family members. His mother testified about the exact moment she realized what she'd found inside that bucket, her voice audio only in the recording because the judge had ruled her face would not be shown on camera. His sister described hearing an unfamiliar woman's voice somewhere in the house that night, footsteps moving up from the basement to the first floor, and then being woken hours later by police officers banging on her bedroom door, having no idea what had happened just one floor below her while she slept. It's a small detail, But it's one of the more chilling parts of the entire case when you sit with it. The idea that Shad's own sister was upstairs asleep in the same house while everything downstairs was unfolding, completely unaware, separated from it all by nothing more than a staircase and a closed door. The forensic testimony from the medical examiner also became a turning point during the trial, not just for what it revealed about the physical evidence, but for how it dismantled parts of the defense's framing. Prosecutors specifically asked him to walk the jury through the amount of force involved in the strangulation itself, and his answer left little room for ambiguity. He described injuries running through multiple layers of tissue in the neck, deep bruising in the muscles, and hemorrhaging that indicated sustained, significant pressure rather than something brief or accidental. That testimony mattered because it directly undercut any suggestion that what happened to Shad could have been some kind of impulsive act that spiraled out of control in an instant. According to the medical evidence, it took real, sustained force to cause that level of injury, a detail that stuck with jurors as they weighed the difference between an accident and an intentional act. It took the jury less than an hour to reach a verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault. But the case wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, because Taylor's plea had included a claim of not guilty by reason of insanity, which meant the trial now moved into a second, entirely separate phase. This time, the burden of proof shifted onto the defense. Their job was to convince that same jury that at the exact moment of the killing, Taylor was so severely mentally impaired that she either couldn't understand what she was doing was wrong, or physically couldn't stop herself even if some part of her did understand. A defense psychologist took the stand and testified that, in her professional opinion, Taylor met the legal threshold for insanity, describing symptoms consistent with a genuine psychotic break rather than simple drug intoxication. She even recounted a bizarre earlier incident from a pretrial evaluation, describing how Taylor had reportedly thrown a plastic chair at her across the room during an interview, then calmly sat back down afterward with an eerily blank expression, showing no physiological response whatsoever, as though nothing unusual had just happened. It's worth noting how the 2 competing diagnoses were framed for the jury, because the difference between them ended up carrying enormous legal weight. The defense's expert described a picture of someone experiencing a full psychotic break, disconnected from reality at the moment of the killing, driven by an underlying disease that existed independent of anything she'd taken that night. The state's expert, on the other hand, offered 3 separate diagnoses tied directly to methamphetamine: use disorder, intoxication, and a substance-induced psychotic disorder, arguing that every symptom Taylor displayed could be traced back to the drug itself rather than to a standalone mental illness. That distinction, methamphetamine-induced psychosis versus an independent psychotic disorder, became the single most important technical detail the jury had to untangle. And it's the kind of nuance that rarely makes it into headlines, but ultimately decided the entire second phase of the trial. The prosecution's own expert witness pushed back hard against that assessment, attributing Taylor's symptoms instead to methamphetamine intoxication and a drug-induced psychotic disorder rather than any separate underlying mental illness that existed independent of her substance use. Under Wisconsin law, voluntary drug use alone doesn't meet the legal bar required for an insanity defense, and that distinction ended up becoming the entire heart of the second phase of trial. Jurors had to wrestle with an incredibly difficult question, trying to separate what might have been a genuine mental health crisis from what might have simply been the predictable, if horrifying, result of a sustained methamphetamine binge. Once again, the jury didn't take long to decide. Within an hour, they rejected the insanity defense entirely. Legally, that outcome meant Taylor would be held fully responsible for everything she had done, sealing her fate as a convicted felon facing a life sentence, rather than being committed to a psychiatric facility for treatment. At sentencing, Taylor appeared in the courtroom shackled to her chair and wearing a spit mask, a clear sign of just how volatile she had become behind bars in the months leading up to that hearing. Victim impact statements followed, and the range of emotion in that room was staggering to witness. Shad's uncle did not hold back his anger, expressing outright disbelief that anyone could do something like this to a person who had trusted her, and telling her directly that he hoped she would eventually face a fate similar to the very serial killer she had seemingly idolized. But then Shad's father stood up, and what he said stunned nearly everyone in that courtroom. Instead of anger, he offered forgiveness. He told Taylor directly that he believed she still had good inside her, that everyone makes mistakes, even if very few come anywhere close to this scale, and that he genuinely hoped she would eventually find a way to become a better person during whatever time she had left. It was an extraordinary moment of grace inside a courtroom that had just spent weeks absorbing some of the most graphic testimony imaginable. The judge, in handing down the final sentence, focused heavily on the need to protect the public going forward. He described the crime as so far removed from ordinary human behavior that it was essentially unpredictable by nature, and said that because a crime like this could occur with no obvious advance warning signs, the community needed to be protected above almost every other consideration. Taylor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of extended supervision on the homicide charge, along with additional consecutive years for the mutilation and sexual assault convictions layered on top. She was ultimately ordered to serve her sentence at a Wisconsin correctional institution, a facility she remains inside to this day. You would think that might be the final chapter of this story, but it isn't. Behind bars, Taylor's erratic and violent behavior reportedly continued well past her sentencing. Reports surfaced of an alleged attack on prison staff in the summer of 2024, which led to entirely new criminal charges being filed against her. In one particularly bizarre courtroom moment in the spring of 2025, she was accused of attacking her own defense attorney for a second time, echoing the exact same pattern of courtroom violence that had already cost her one lawyer years earlier during her original trial. It's a pattern worth sitting with for a moment. Back in February of 2023, during a hearing where the judge had just ruled to delay her trial, Taylor turned on her original attorney and attacked him right there in front of the judge, with no clear explanation for why. That attorney later told the court their working relationship was permanently and irreparably broken, and he was granted permission to withdraw from the case entirely. A new court-appointed attorney stepped in, and the case moved forward. But the volatility never really went away. It resurfaced again and again over the following years, first during pre-trial competency hearings, then during the trial itself, and now again well after her conviction, suggesting that whatever was driving her behavior that February night in 2022 didn't disappear once the verdict came down. Following that second attack, her attorney at the time requested to withdraw from the case, and proceedings ultimately continued with Taylor appearing by video conference rather than in person. Eventually, she pleaded no contest to a disorderly conduct charge connected to that incident and received additional jail time to be served consecutively on top of her existing life sentence. As of the most recent available records, Taylor Schabusiness remains incarcerated at that same Wisconsin correctional facility, a life sentence that, by nearly every account, and by the nature of Wisconsin law itself, she will never leave. This case forces anyone who hears about it to sit with some genuinely uncomfortable questions about addiction, about untreated mental illness, and about how much of what a person does while deep in the grip of drugs is truly them, and how much of it isn't. There isn't a clean, comfortable answer here. There's just a family that lost a son and a brother in the most horrific way imaginable, and a woman who will now spend the remainder of her life paying for what happened in that basement on a cold February night in 2022. Every detail in this story comes directly from court testimony, official criminal complaints, and public reporting on the case, laid out here in a way that respects both the facts and the family who lived through it. What makes this case linger in people's minds long after they first hear about it isn't just the violence itself, disturbing as that is. It's the layers underneath it. The childhood loss at 11 years old, the years of untreated trauma, the drug addiction that seemed to accelerate every downward spiral, the diagnosed mental illness that went in and out of treatment without ever really being stabilized, and then, sitting on top of all of it, an apparent fixation on one of the most notorious killers in American history. Courts exist to answer a narrow legal question, guilty or not guilty, sane or insane at the moment of the crime, and in this case, the jury answered both of those questions clearly and quickly. But the broader question of how someone ends up capable of doing what Taylor did to Shad doesn't have a tidy legal answer. It sits somewhere in the overlap between a broken support system, a substance abuse crisis that never got fully addressed, and whatever was happening inside her own mind long before that February night. Shad's family will carry the weight of that night for the rest of their lives, and so, in a different way, will everyone who sat on that jury, listened to that evidence, and had to render a verdict on something that most people can barely bring themselves to imagine.